being here this morning. Brother Guy Orbison, over the years, has become a friend to many of us here through the Searching the Scriptures seminars. He's been married to Mary Rowe for almost 50 years, as he mentioned this morning in Bible class. A great relationship that has brought 3 children into the world. Started out at Bear Valley School of Preaching. Through there, he became an associate minister, a youth minister. He also taught at Bear Valley. He's written many articles for newspapers, spoke on a radio program. And for several years, that is what brought him to Clyde, Texas. You're talking about Texas. You know, there's not much good that comes out of Texas, is it, look? Then he moved to Durango, Colorado, where he has been serving there as a pulpit minister. He started writing for the Rocky Mountain Christian Chronicle. For 22 years, he's written an article for the Durango Herald for 12 years. He used to hold up to 20 gospel meetings a year, and that is quite a labor. He directed the workshop in the Word for 22 years, and tackling the text workshop in Arizona for 6 years, and then he started the Searching the Scripture workshop, which we've been hosting for the last 3 years. He writes a monthly publication called Working in the Word since 1997. He directed the preacher training program, which began in 1998, putting over 22 men in full-time preaching, and that's what Stephen went through. And he doesn't really like accolades, but I believe that men like Brother Guy deserve accolades. And I'm glad that we have Brother Guy coming to us to deliver God's Word this week. And I'm going to turn it over to Brother Guy Orbison this morning. And all we usually say around here is preach the Word.
Thank you. Amen to that. Thank you for the invitation to be with you. It's a joy to be here and to renew some acquaintances that I've made through the years, especially with Stephen and Becky and their sweet family. I know that you're proud of them, what good servants they are. Thank you for praying for my wife. It was just Wednesday of this past week that we learned that she now has stage 4 cancer in the lungs, and we're kind of numb. We're not sure what we're going to do yet. I've begun canceling meetings, and couldn't very well cancel this one, didn't want to, and it was so close. And so I'm glad that you're here and are praying for our situation. We'll talk a little more about that today and tonight in the lesson I'm going to present this evening on joy in trials. And there is a great way that we find joy in our trials. I want us to turn to Philippians chapter 2. J.D. read from that at the communion table, but we want to drop down to verse 12, and I want to read verses 12 through 18. So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent children of God, above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may have cause to glory, because I did not run in vain nor toil in vain. But even if I am being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice and share my joy with you all. And you too, I urge you, rejoice in the same way and share your joy with me. When I was in elementary school and was learning math, I learned that the shortest distance between 2 points was a straight line. You remember those days? But as I have grown and experienced so much of life, I have learned that the shortest distance is the distance between the day of your birth and the day of your death. Life is so short, isn't it? It's amazing how fast we move through life. If you visit a cemetery, you read tombstones, you'll see a man's name there, and then under his name, they'll have the date of his birth, and then there'll be a dash, and then there's the date of his death. And I've always found that interesting, and I read a poem some years ago that someone wrote about that dash. You see, the sum of your life is not the date of your birth, nor is it the date of your death. It's to be found in that little dash between those two dates. Everything that a man is and was is contained in just that little dash on the tombstone. All of his experiences, all of his adventures, all of his joy, all of his love is contained in that little dash. Life is short. It's just a dash of life that God has given us. The question is, what are we doing with our dash? We're still in the dash, aren't we? What are we doing with it? And I want to talk to you about the joy of Christian living, because that's what Paul is talking about in this text. And I believe that as Christians, we ought to be the most joyous people on the planet. We ought to take joy in just living the life that God has given us to live. In fact, the entire 4 chapters of Philippians is really dedicated to the idea of joy. The word joy or rejoice, or some nuance of those terms, is found 14 times in this little book of Philippians. In fact, in chapter 4, Paul actually commands, there's a Greek imperative where he says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. It's a command. And I think that the Philippians were not rejoicing, and that's why Paul mentions it over and over again. In fact, in chapter 4, he says, be anxious for nothing. I think they are anxious because they're not seeing the reality. I believe that a theme in Philippians is simply this, that when you see the reality, it will result in rejoicing. You see, they thought that Paul was enduring difficult times because he's in prison. He's in Rome when he writes this letter. But in chapter 1, he gives them the reality. He shows them the way he sees it. And it's nothing to be negative about, because the whole Praetorian Guard is receiving the word because Paul is preaching. People, other Christians, are now gaining the courage to speak out the word. He's trying to give them the reality, and once you see the reality, it will result in rejoicing. There are 3 things that I want you to see this morning from this text that we just read. Here's the first thing. It's found in verses 12 and 13, and that is simply this. Something has happened inside of you personally that needs to be seen externally. Something has happened in you that needs to be seen on the outside of you. Now, Paul begins by saying you need to obey. And he basically is saying, I can't be with you, but it doesn't matter if I'm with you or not. Whether I'm there or absent, you need to be obedient to the things that I've given you from God by means of the Word of God. And then he says, you need to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Now, when you read that, a lot of times we tend to think, oh, that means to work hard to make sure that your salvation is secure. But that's not what he's talking about. You're never saved by your works. That's impossible. We are always saved and brought into the relationship that we have with God based upon the grace of God, the mercy of God, and not on our works. You can never earn your salvation. What Paul is saying there is that when you were saved, something changed within you. Something happened on the inside of you, and now we need to see that on the outside of you. Bring it out, work it out. And you do that with fear and trembling. That doesn't mean to be scared to death. If you look at how the Bible uses that expression over and over again, generally it means that you are afraid of messing up. You are afraid of bringing shame to the name of God by the way that you conduct yourself. You so reverence Him. You so love God that it's with fear and trembling that you do everything because you don't want to bring shame to His name. And so we bring out in the outside, in our conduct, what's happened to us on the inside, the change that has occurred. In verse 13, Paul says that it's God that's in you. God is at work in you. And I know that commentators and preachers go crazy with something like that, and they will make all sorts of claims, but there's nothing supernatural here. There's nothing really mysterious about this, that God is working His will and His purpose within us. He does that by means of His Word and our bringing His will into our will. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 2, Paul says that we are not to be conformed to the world, but be transformed. How? By the renewing of our mind. You see, that's a change from the inside that should be seen on the outside. And when we get the will of God into our mind, into our inner man, and so we've renewed our thinking, renewed our mind, so we're on the same page with God, and we're trying to serve God as best we can and do His will, we ought to see a difference in our life. Paul calls it a transformation. In the Greek, that word sounds like metamorphosis. It's a change of form. It's the way a caterpillar becomes something entirely different. He becomes a butterfly. And so you and I, with our salvation, have become something entirely different than what we once were. We are transformed into the very likeness of God because we've taken on His will and His purpose for our life. Now that's the first thing that Paul says. Here's the second thing that he wants you to know. As a congregation, you and I need to present ourselves to the world in a favorable way. He uses a couple of illustrations here, or images. The first is the children of God. Do you recognize that you are a child of God and that you're in the family of God? And so Paul begins here in verse 14 to tell us that we need to do everything without grumbling or disputing. Now, we know what that means, don't we? How are you doing this morning? Oh, it's a terrible day. It's just really, really bad. I just don't know. That's grumbling, isn't it? We can't see anything positive about life. There's nothing good that's happening. And we grumble to one another. We complain about one another. That's what's involved in that. We know what disputing is, don't we? That's when we can't get along with one another. Did you see what she did? Well, I'll never speak to her again. Did you hear what he taught? Boy, I tell you, that's not Church of Christ doctrine. We cannot have that. And we dispute and we fight and we fuss. And Paul says, don't you recognize who you are? You know, the world is looking on. He says we live in the midst of a very perverse, crooked, and perverse generation. That's true of every generation. People are looking at us. And we claim to be the children of God. But folks, if we're fighting and fussing and we can't get along, we're not reflecting the image of God, are we? We're certainly not exhibiting ourselves as being a part of His family. And then Paul turns to the imagery of light. He says that we are to appear as lights in this world. That's at the end of verse 15. And how do we do that? He says in the next verse, we are holding fast the word of life, so that in the day of Christ he may have cause to glory, Paul, and has not run in vain or toiled in vain. We are to appear as lights to the world. When you think of light, you think of being able to see. The opposite of that is darkness. And you can't see anything. What the darkness conceals, light reveals, doesn't it? You remember in the late 60s, there was a movie called Wait Until Dark. I don't remember it because I'm only 39. I just don't remember things that far back. But when I was in college, when that movie came out, we decided in the dorm to play Wait Until Dark. If you remember the story, it was a blind girl, Audrey Hepburn, and there was, these guys were after her, Richard Crenna and Alan Arkin, I believe, were the stars. Boy, I am dating myself, aren't I? Anyway, we decided, okay, we're going to make a dorm room totally black. Man, we covered the windows, taped paper over them, put stuffed towels under the door. I have never felt darkness like in that dorm room that night when we turned off the lights. And the idea was, we're going to sneak up on you, scare you. It got real quiet. You couldn't see a thing. When finally the guy who was assigned to turn on the light, there was a fellow right there at my face, scared me to death. What the darkness conceals, the light reveals. You know, the world is in darkness. They can't see the reality. They don't know about God. So many people in the world today think they evolved from monkeys. They don't know about Jesus. They don't know that they are in sin and they're drowning in sin. They're in the dark. They can't see the reality. You and I are to be light. We are to shine forth. Jesus said, let the world see your good works, that they may glorify your Father who is in heaven. That we may bring them into a relationship with God. We are to be lights. People should see on the outside of us as the way we treat one another as a church. They ought to see light. And they ought to be drawn to the light so that they might come out of the darkness of being lost and being ignorant and drowning in sin. And so Paul is telling the Corinthians, you quit that fighting and fussing. You see yourself as children. You recognize you're the light in the world. And you do that because of what's coming, the day of the Lord. That's the day of Christ. And you know that that's the last day when the Lord will return. And Paul wants to be proud and boastful of what he's done in Philippi with those Christians there. And if they're living in accordance with the purpose of God, he will find glory on that day. He will not have run in vain, he says. You see, he ran to Philippi to bring the gospel to them. Did he run in vain if they're not living up to the gospel? Did he toil in vain? He worked hard in bringing those people into the Lord and trying to keep them in a right relationship with the Lord. In the day of the Lord, will he have toiled in vain? He will if they're just fighting and fussing and they're not unified and they're not behaving as children of light. Now comes the last point that he makes in the last few verses, where he says that I want you to see something in me about the joy of living the Christian life. Remember, Paul is in prison. He's in prison. That's not an easy thing to have to endure. But he says in verse 17 and 18, even if I am being poured out as a drink offering, he's talking about his death, the possibility of his death. Earlier in chapter 1, he says, I don't know what's coming. I don't know if it'll be life or death. But he also said, but for me to live, well, that's Christ. To die, that's gain. How can a man say that? Only if you see things through the eyes of Paul, the way he saw the reality, could you say that. And now he's referencing that. He says that I may be poured out as a drink offering. We have to go back to the Old Testament to understand that. In Numbers chapter 28, when they had a burnt offering, a sacrifice, what concluded that sacrifice, the offering of that sacrifice, was the ritual of pouring out a libation, either on the sacrifice or to the side of the altar. Often that libation was the wine, but it marked the end of the sacrifice. Paul is saying, I am presenting to God a sacrifice. It's your faith. That's what he says here. But I may be the libation that's poured out on this sacrifice. In other words, my death may end this offering up of the sacrifice. He sees the possibility that he's going to die there in prison. But notice what he says in verse 17, I rejoice in this. I rejoice and share my joy with you all. And you too, I urge you, rejoice in the same way and share your joy with me. What Paul is saying is, if you see the reality, it's going to result in rejoicing. For me, to die is gain. It just means I've reached the journey's end. I've been walking this journey all my life. For me, to die is to go and be with the Lord. What could be better than that? It's gain. I rejoice. Now I want you to see it so that you rejoice. And then he says, when I say you rejoicing, guess what? That's going to come back on me, and that's going to make me even happier to see you rejoice. It's coming back and forth, back and forth. See the way things really are results in rejoicing in the Lord. So don't be anxious about anything. He'll tell them in chapter 4. But here's a command. Rejoice in the Lord always. Let me say it again, he says. Rejoice. Rejoice. Here's what we learn in this little text that Paul gives us. If there's a change that has happened within you on the level of your mind and heart, if Christ has come into your life, if God is at work within you, then we ought to see that in the way that you conduct yourselves externally. We also should see as a church that we are presenting ourselves in a favorable way so that people will be drawn to us as the family of God and as light in a world of darkness. You know, it's kind of hard for people to want to be a part of a group that's always fighting and fussing. Who wants to be a part of that family? If you say, I have found the life, the true life of God, but you live like the world, then you're no better than the world, are you? and you really are in darkness and haven't found the true light of God. We learn from this passage that bad things can happen to you in life, but you can still rejoice because of what you see about the reality of your relationship with God. You can rejoice and share your joy with others, and then rejoice anymore when you see them enjoying the rejoicing of you. Bad things can happen to you in life. When I was a young preacher, I went to the home of one of the elders of the congregation. We were having a cookout. It was a great night of fellowship. About 30 people were there. I tell you, we enjoyed a good meal that he cooked out for us, and we enjoyed the fellowship of Christians being with one another. What a great family we were in those days at that congregation. At the end of the evening, he wanted to thank everyone, and so we all got into a circle in the living room, and we held hands. My wife was on my left hand, Mary, and another man was on the right hand. And we were going to have a closing prayer, and he was thanking us for coming to his home and sharing such sweet fellowship. And it was kind of quiet, and a little girl on the other side of the living room, this is a big living room, and we're all in a huge circle. She let go of her mommy and daddy's hands. She's about 3 years old. She ran all the way across the living room and made me hold her hand. And everybody said, "Oh, isn't that sweet?" She wanted to hold Guy's hand. And her hand was so tiny, she just grabbed my finger, And so I've got Mary on the left and this sweet little, beautiful little girl that made my heart rejoice on the right. And then we bowed our heads in prayer. And during the prayer, this sweet little girl picked her nose with my finger. It occurred to me that she looked over all the fingers in that room and picked my finger. I tell you, bad things can happen to you. Maybe that's not the worst that could happen. You might find yourself in a prison in Rome one day. But Paul says, even if I die, that's gain. That's gain. The date of your birth, that's already etched in the stone. That will stand over your grave. All that's left is to put the date of your death. You're now living in the dash. What are you doing with your dash? I tell you, we don't have much time. The Lord's brother, James, tells us that life is like a vapor. It just suddenly appears and then it's gone, isn't it? It fades away. And that's the way life is. But it's all contained on that tombstone in the dash. All that you were, all that you did, all the good things, all the terrible things that you did, they're contained there. We only have a dash of life. It seems to me that we ought to spend it well. I tell you, Christians all over this nation, I've seen so many in the meetings that I've been able to preach. Some of them are just getting weary of it all. It's getting harder, isn't it, to be a Christian in our country? We have diminishing numbers in our congregations. That's kind of discouraging. And people are just drifting away, aren't they? Our leadership, our elders and our preachers, they've held the line for so long, and they get so weary, don't they, of just defending the truth that sometimes they compromise. And now we have so many that are leading others into apostasy because they're just so weary of fighting it. But I'm reminded that we only have a dash of life, and we better be spending it well and spending it in service of the Lord and truth. So many people are involving themselves in so many unimportant things. Oh, I like baseball, I like football, all of those things. I think you ought to enjoy that. But when that comes before the Lord and your service to the Lord, there's something wrong with that, and you're moving in the wrong direction. We need to wake up to realize that we only have a dash of life, and that we need to spend it well on what is important and what is internal in life. I think that today, just by reading this text and understanding what Paul is saying, that I can enjoy my Christian life better today. That just today I can remember that I only have this dash of life and that I need to spend it well. I can let go of all the grudges that I might be holding, of all the hatred that might be within my heart, and grab hold of all that is positive and that's true life that God wants us to have. I tell you, we need to reach out and grab hold of God's life that He's given us, to see it as the Apostle Paul did, and to be able to say with Paul, in this, no matter what, I rejoice. When you see the reality, it leads to rejoicing. Your spiritual life begins on the day that you are born again in the baptism for remission of sins. That's what Jesus taught. You must be born again. That's the true date of your birth, isn't it? That's when life really begins for you. And if you haven't been born again, then you're still out there in the world, in the darkness, sharing that with a crooked and perverse generation. You need to come into the family of God. You need to be born into the family of God and become a light in a world filled with darkness. I tell you, it's the greatest life on this earth, and what glory awaits us in eternity. We invite you to be a part of that life. If we can assist you in any way, come to the front. Let us help you while we stand together, sing the song of encouragement.